Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Please state your name and spell your last name.
Jennifer McCabe, McCabe.
And where do you live, ma'am?
Approximately 20. I lived in Canton, except when I first got married, I lived in Stoughton for a year or two.
And where do you live currently in Canton? How long have you lived there?
I live at 12 Country Lane, and I've lived there about 10 years.
And prior to that, where did you live in Canton before Country Lane?
15 Sutcliffe Ave in Canton.
And how long did you live on Sutcliffe?
Approximately 10 years.
And with regard to both addresses, who, if anyone, do you live there with?
I live there with my husband, Matt, and my 4 daughters.
And how old are your 4 daughters?
15, 16, 18, and 20.
Now, if I could turn your attention to January 28th and to January 29th of 2022, do you recall those dates?
I do, yes.
And do you recall what days of the week they were?
Friday and a Saturday.
So starting with Friday, January 28th in the evening, do you recall on that night or where you went?
Well, first I set up at my house for a team's hockey team. Then I met up with some parents for the Canton High basketball team. So we met up with some parents before. We had a drink, appetizers. My younger 2 were with us. We fed them dinner. And then we went on to Canton High School to the basketball game.
Now, starting back, the oldest daughter with the hockey dinner at your house, that was your daughter, Allie, is that correct?
Yes.
She's your oldest?
Yes.
Now, the daughter who had the basketball game, is that your second oldest?
Yes.
And with regard to her, she was on varsity team, is that right?
Yes.
For Canton High School?
Yes.
And with respect to just basketball in general, when the kids were younger, what, if any, role did you have in regard to that?
Direction. I'll allow it, but then you'll move on quickly.
I was a basketball coach, rec, well, the town program.
For how many years?
I believe with Emily, I started when she was in 5th grade, and then I was also a coach for my daughter, Olivia, I think starting when she was in 6th grade. And with my youngest, I think I coached from 1st grade on, up until 8th grade.
Now, as far as the game was concerned, is there sort of a typical start time for high school basketball game?
Yeah, move on. We know the time. Move on.
After the basketball game, where did you go?
My husband and I dropped my youngest daughter home, and then the waterfall. My sister, Nicole.
How many sisters do you have?
3.
And do you recall about what time it was that you got to the waterfall?
Approximately 9 o'clock.
And when you say we, who do you mean?
My husband, Matt, and myself.
And do you recall which vehicle that you were in going around Canton?
I believe it was my car, yes.
And what kind of car was that?
Denali, Yukon, I think. Denali, yeah.
So bigger type vehicle?
Yes, big SUV.
Now, with respect to, you got a cell phone around that time, is that correct? Your cell phone, what, if any, connection did that have between cell phone and vehicle?
At that point, don't think mine was connected. I'm not sure.
Now, when you arrived at the waterfall, did you go right in, or what, if anything, did you do?
I waited a few minutes because my husband was on a phone call.
And at some point, did you and your husband then go in?
Yes.
And when you arrived in the waterfall, where within the waterfall?
We walked in, and I believe we sat at the 3rd table.
At the time that you arrived, who, if anyone, was there that you were familiar with that table?
Chris and Julie Albert, Nicole Albert, Caitlin Albert, Tristan Morris.
And at some point shortly after that, or at some point after that, who, if anyone, out of the group that you were with?
Nick Kolakidis did, and a little bit after. And then Brian Albert and Brian Higgins arrived. And then Karen and John arrived.
And prior to Karen and anyone from the group had left?
I believe Tristan left maybe to go to sleep because he had to plow, I think.
Now, with reference to Karen and John, talking about John O'Keefe and Karen, correct?
Yes.
And how long had you known John O'Keefe?
Approximately.
How was it that you first came?
John's sister in her hood and my daughter became friends with John's niece when they were in kindergarten. And during that kindergarten, John's sister and then brother-in-law passed away, and John moved in and took care of the kids.
Just for clarity purposes, this would have been when you were living at the home on Sutcliffe?
Yes.
And then after John moved out with his niece and nephew, what, if any relationship did you have with either John or his niece specifically?
So my daughter was very nice. And so, she would be over all the time, and JJ would come over with Patrick and pick her up.
And how would you describe your relationship with John O'Keefe?
He was my friend. I love John. He was an amazing guy.
Now, with reference to Karen Read, and just for clarity purposes, do you see Karen Read in the courtroom today?
Yes, I do.
Did you identify just as?
He's seated between her attorneys.
John just has to record reflect identification.
Yes.
By the witness. Now, with respect to the.
John had reached out to me saying that he was dating a new girl and that she had MS and I also have MS. So he said he would like for me to meet her.
How long have you had MS?
5 years this October.
And do you recall specifically when around that was, what year, what month, anything like that?
That I met Miss Read?
Yes.
Yes, they came over in July of 2020.
And came over to your house, is that correct?
Yes, they came over to kids, swam. I have a pool.
Now, over the course of, you were familiar, obviously, that Miss Read was dating Mr. O'Keefe, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of time.
Yes. Sorry.
Over the course of time from July of 2020, when you met her, to January of 20, how often would you see Miss Read?
It would vary. There were times that we would bump into sports or, for my daughter's birthday party, when it was time to pick up, they'd come over and hang out. Or it just varied. We have 4 kids, so we're always kind of in all different directions. Sometimes it depends on what sport month it is and what team we're with.
And how would you describe your relationship with Miss Read?
I enjoyed Miss Read. I really liked her. I thought we connected from the beginning. She was very easy to talk to. She had MS, I had MS, and there's not a lot of people our age that I personally know that like what I was going through. So we had that in common.
Now, with respect, to either starting with Mr. O'Keefe, was your friendship the type where you would have any sort of discussions about his girls that he dated at any point in time that you were friends with him? Telling you about his relationship with Miss Read specifically. Objection.
I'm going to allow that. I'd like to see counsel at sidebar for just a minute, please.
Relationship with Mr. O'Keefe.
Yes, similar.
Now, on that evening, if I get to the waterfall,
Mm-hmm.
You arrive about 9. About what time was it that you left?
Approximately midnight, a little give or take.
And so during the 3 hours or so that you were there, the mood or the me time you were there?
Fine, friendly, normal, typical night,
And Mr. O'Keefe and Miss Read came into the bar?
Correct.
And when they came into the bar, where did they go in relation to where you were?
They came right over and talked to the group that we were with.
And when Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant came over, what, if anything, did you observe or have with?
Oh, she had brought a glass with her and kind of took it out of her coat and just kind of chuckled about it.
About the glass.
I believe it had ridges on it.
What, if anything, as far as what was in the glass?
It was clear.
Was there any other kind of like a straw or a lime or anything like that?
I-
in the waterfall?
Yes.
And where was it?
See
Any location to the waterfall?
just right up the street.
Now, over the evening, you were at a bar. Fair to say you were drinking. Is that?
Yes.
Do you recall specifically what you were drinking?
I think beer.
And same question with regard to Mr. O'Keefe. Do you recall him drinking, and if anything was he?
I can't be certain.
And with respect to Ms. Reed, same question as far as do you recall her drinking, and if so, what, if anything, do you recall her?
Again, I remember a glass with clear liquid in it.
Any different glass beyond the one?
I don't remember, sorry.
Now, when you left the waterfall sometime around the
Yes.
call, just generally what?
Yes, his niece had just gotten into Bishop Fian, so he was very excited.
And with respect to Ms. Reed, did you speak to her at the bar?
Yes.
And do you recall what, if anything, the two of you spoke about?
Yes.
What was it?
Karen had shared a little bit of frustration that morning, or one morning she had taken Kaylee to Dunkin' Donuts, and John, was frustrated, didn't, saying, don't take her. She's going to, make a habit of it, meaning like she's going to come to expect it every day. And then we just talked about how, challenging it is with kids. And, she mentioned that that's kind of all they ever fight about. And I said, yeah, well, welcome to parenthood, and, she just is a little bit frustrated, felt like the family needed to be doing more to help. And she just wished she had, more time, just her and John. But again, it was just, girlfriend to girlfriend kind of venting.
As far as Mr. O'Keefe was concerned, what, if any, observations did you make as to how he was dressed?
Baseball hat, jeans. That's what I remember.
Do you recall any sort of winter coat or heavier coat or anything like that?
No.
Over the course of the evening at the waterfall, what, if any, discussion was there amongst the group as far as going somewhere next or what to do after the waterfall?
Karen had asked Chris if we could go up to D&E. She wanted to go up to D&E and have him cook some food.
And was that something that was brought up by the defendant once, more than once, or something?
Many times.
And what was sort of the response from the group in regard to going to D&E and making food?
So Brian, Chris, and Matt do this annual weight loss challenge every year, and it was in the midst of that. So they were like, no, we can't go up there. We're not going to eat. We'll do it another time.
Now, following that conversation, what, if any, other, let me ask you this, why did you go to the waterfall in the first place?
So I went to meet my sister, Nicole. She was heading there because she was going to go have a drink with her. Her son was going to have some friends and then meet out. So I was going to meet them for a drink for my nephew's birthday. Yes.
Brian Albert Jr. ever show up at the waterfall that evening?
He did not, no.
Why not?
Brian suffers from anxiety, and during that time period, he was really struggling.
He decided to stay home.
He just decided to stay home, yes.
And so after the discussion about going over to D&E and then communication of not going over, what, if any, other discussion was had as to where people were going or what was happening after leaving the waterfall?
Brian Albert Sr. just made a general, hey, I'm going to go home, have a drink with Brian if anyone would like to come.
And was that something that was just to certain people, or was it expressed at the table, or how was that expressed?
It was expressed to everyone, like, hey, we're going to go back home, have a beer with Brian if anyone would like to come.
Now, after that was sort of put out to the table, what, if any, discussion did you have in regard to that with either Mr. O'Keefe, Ms. Reed, or both?
Both of them. I said, oh, you guys should come. Do you want to come?
And did they indicate that that was something that they wanted to do, or did they indicate that they were coming?
They both wanted to come, and they said they were coming. Yes.
Now, when you left the waterfall,
Mhm.
who, if anyone, left with you or left at the same time?
I believe I walked out with Karen. I know I walked out with Karen, and I believe Miss Kolakidis as well.
Prior to you leaving, your sister Nicole and her husband Brian, had they left prior to you leaving?
Yes.
And so you're walking out with the defendant and Ms. Kolakidis, is that right?
Yes.
And when you were walking out with them, what, if anything, was the sort of conversation or the discussion as you were walking out the door?
Well, Matt and John were still inside. So at one point I said, "Oh, Karen, why don't you just come with me?" Figuring, because, Matt can talk to anyone, and God knows how long he was going to stay in there. So I was just like, "Hey, do you want to drive with me and they can meet us?" Yes.
Now, as far as the car that you had parked there before, where was that parked in relation to what?
I believe I had to kind of walk straight out
In the parking lot?
in the parking lot. Yes.
And after you had exited from the waterfall,
Yes, he did.
and
I believe briefly, Karen, him, and I all spoke. Yes. Them coming back to Fairview.
after sort of the two of you parted ways, did you observe where Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant went?
I just saw them they walked left, I walked straight.
And if one were to walk left in the direction they were walking, where would that bring them to?
Washington Street, the main street.
So you went over then to your car in the parking lot?
Yes.
And while you were in your car in the parking lot, well, let me ask you this first. When you walked out of the waterfall, what, if anything, was different about the weather from when you had walked?
It had started to snow.
And as far as the snow was concerned, what was that initial point when you walked out of the waterfall? Had it accumulating or anything like that?
Yes, I would say, it was starting to cover the car, so you'd have to put your windshield wipers on to clear it.
So you didn't have to get the scraper out or anything like that, just click on the windshield.
Clip on the windshield wipers. I probably was lazy and just rolled the windows down to get it off the windows.
And so you're in the car for some period of time waiting for your husband, correct?
Yes.
And about how long is it that you're waiting for your husband before he comes out?
Actually, it wasn't long. I think I turned the car on, and then I saw him walking, and I pulled up.
And while you're waiting for your husband, or shortly after he gets to you, any communication did you receive at that point?
I received a text from John saying where to.
And with respect to that, did you respond in kind via text, or how did you respond, if at all, to Mr. O'Keefe?
I was driving, so I called him.
And when you called him, if you know, was that something that was done through Bluetooth with regard to the car, or?
Yes, it would have been, because it was my phone and I was driving, so I would have got it over the car. Yes, I plugged it in when I got it. I always plug my phone in when I get in, if I'm driving.
And with your husband in the car, it's fair to say that he could hear both sides of the conversation as far as you in.
Yes.
And so that initial call that you placed to Mr. O'Keefe, is that done while you're driving?
Yes.
And what, if anything, are you telling him as far as that initial call is concerned?
He had asked for he said where to. I gave him the address, and then I believe I, just started giving him directions, and I actually think Matt spoke over me and saying, go this way. And then I said, yeah, you just go down to Fairview. It's at the bottom.
And so as far as the directions, do you recall anything specifically about what you told Mr. O'Keefe as far as where the directions were?
Well, he actually called back a second time. And when he called back a second time, I instructed him that it was by a friend's house, one of his niece and my daughter's friend. And I said, oh, it's right, go past Bella's street. It's at the bottom of the hill.
And before we get to that, just as far as that initial phone call, actually Fairview Road, you're familiar with?
Yes.
And it's where your sister lives with her family, correct?
Yes.
And if I could just ask, with regard to your sister's husband, Brian, how long have you known him?
Since I was in kindergarten, very long time.
So they had dated for some period of time before they got married, and they've been married for some significant period of time.
Yeah, she had a crush on him for years. Then they dated, I think, for 10 years, and before they got married. So yeah, they've been together most of my life.
Familiar with Fairview in the sense that there's on one end of it is Chapman and one end of it is Cedar Crest. correct?
Correct.
And just in that initial phone call that you had with Mr. O'Keefe and you and your husband are giving directions, you recall if you were indicating to him to Crest or go to Chapman in order to get onto Fairview?
Go to Chapman.
And is that the way that you went as far as going from Washington Street downtown to Fairview?
Yes.
Now, how long a drive is that going from the waterfall to Fairview?
Approximately 5+ minutes, depending on if you hit lights.
Now, if you're indicating you're indicating to someone to come down Chapman, and you said it was, I'm sorry, your testimony is it's sort of towards the end from that direction?
The end of Fairview, the bottom of Fairview.
And that's to my point as far as the bottom.
Mhm.
But any kind of incline or decline, or how does the road sort of situated as you come from the Chapman side down to where your sister lives, 34 Fairview?
It's a hill.
And the hill goes down, is that correct?
Yes.
Is that somewhat of a precipitous? How would you describe sort of the hill?
Well, the first hill is a bit steep, and then it flattens a little, and then there's another hill. But the second hill is more long.
So there's actually two hills as you're going down, correct?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned the second call, Mr. O'Keefe then calls you.
Yes.
And about how much time elapsed between when you first talked to Mr. O'Keefe and the second?
Approximately 4 or 5 minutes tops.
During either call that you had with Mr. O'Keefe, could you hear anything? You had it on Bluetooth, correct?
Yes.
Could you tell whether or not he was connected to a Bluetooth? Could you hear anything in the background?
I couldn't know.
And as far as when you were speaking to Mr. O'Keefe, did he express an intent that he was going to the house at Fairview?
Yes, he was driving there and he was trying to find it.
And when he indicated that he was trying to find it, was he expressing that in singular or plural or something else?
No, more general, like where is it type.
Did he make any reference during the time that you were talking to him to anyone he was with?
No.
And now, as far as the second call, you indicated, what did you use exactly as sort of a geographic locator?
My daughter and his niece's very close friend lives on a side street off of Fairview. So I just said, go past Bella Street, and it's at the bottom.
And Bella is someone that, through his niece, John O'Keefe would have known, correct?
Correct.
Now, at this time, what, if any, relationship were you aware of between Bella's mother and John O'Keefe?
They had dated
I'm going to allow it.
They had dated briefly years before.
Now, was that sort of the substance of the conversation that you had with Mr. O'Keefe in that second phone call?
Yes.
Now, after that second phone call, did you speak to Mr. O'Keefe on the phone at any point in time after that?
No.
Now, you arrived at the house on Fairview. Do you recall where you parked when you got there?
Yes, pulled into the driveway.
And the driveway at the house at Fairview essentially has two garage doors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Sort of widens out as you get to the top closer to the house.
Yes.
Do you recall where in relation to the driveway was that you parked when you got there?
I just remember pulling in. There was definitely a car in front of me. There possibly could have been a car to the left.
You exit the vehicle, go into the house, correct?
Correct.
When you get to the house, who, if anyone, do you observe?
When I walk in, Caitlin Albert, Brian Albert, Julie Nagel, and Sarah Levinson are all sitting at the kitchen table. My sister, Nicole, was in the kitchen wiping the counters because she's always cleaning. And Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were in the, I guess you'd call it the TV room area, just standing and talking.
Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm just having a little trouble hearing you. So
Oh, okay.
that microphone, you can adjust that any way you want. So anywhere you want to put that.
Okay.
And so when you come into the house, where were you mentioned a table? Where were people situated?
In the kitchen.
Now, with respect to what was going on at the house throughout the course of the evening,
I sat at the table and I just spoke to Brian and Katie and the two girls most of the night.
and just so we're clear, when you're talking about Brian, that's Brian Albert Jr. or Little Brian?
Yeah, little Brian. Yeah, little Brian.
Now, as far as at any point in time when you were at the house, you familiar with a gentleman named, someone named Colin Albert?
I am, yes.
And how do you know?
He is my friend's son and my sister's nephew.
Your friend Julie's son, correct?
Yeah, so my friend Julie's son.
And your oldest daughter, Allie, was Colin friends, or is Colin friends with your oldest daughter, Allie?
Yes, they're born a week or two apart, and we've kind of just, they've done everything together. They're very good friends.
Now, at any point in time that you were there on that early morning, did you see Colin Albert at all?
No,
And when you arrived at the house, obviously you're familiar with your daughter and the car that she drives around that time. Did you see your daughter there, Allie, at any point in time?
no,
Were you aware at any point in time in that early morning hour that you were there that your daughter had been there at any point in time prior?
Sustained.
With reference to the home, at any point in time, did John O'Keefe ever come inside the house that night?
no.
During the time that you were there, let me ask more specifically, about how long a period of time was it that you were there, or about what time did you leave?
I believe I left approximately around 1:30, 1:45, approximately.
And do you know about what time it was that you arrived there?
I'd say approximately somewhere between 12:20, 12:30. Well, 12:20, I believe, 12:20-ish, because the last call from John, when I went back and looked, was 12:18.
Now, similar to what I asked about the waterfall, as far as the sort of mood, demeanor inside the house, what, if anything, do you recall with respect to that?
Good. Everybody was in a good mood. There was no, Brian and Brian were talking. My sister was cleaning. I was talking with the kids, just a normal night.
Now, while you were in the kitchen dining room area for the time that you were there, did you see anybody or observe anybody from the group that you just described go anywhere else in the house as far as away from that area?
Julie Nagel went outside.
So beyond Julie Nagel going outside, did you see anybody else go upstairs, downstairs, to a basement area or anywhere else in the house?
No,
Now, when you were in the car and you were driving, you hooked your phone up to the charger, is that right?
yes,
Do you recall charging your phone at any point in time when you were at your sister's house on Fairview that night?
I don't recall.
And you mentioned Julie Nagel, Sarah Levinson. Were those people that you knew prior to that night of the 28th?
I was familiar with who Sarah Levinson was, maybe had run into her at different points. Julie Nagel was closer to Brian, so I would see her. I think she's dog sat for me when I've been away. Like, Brian will do it, but then if he's not available, Julie will do it. I don't know if she had dog sat for me before then or right after then, but I was definitely familiar with Julie, and she possibly could have dog sat for me prior to that.
And now, with reference, there was also someone there by the name of Brian Higgins, is that correct?
Correct.
And that is also someone who was there prior to you getting there, is that right?
Yes.
And what, if anything, did you know about Mr. Higgins, or did you know him prior to that?
I had met him a few times. He's Brian Albert's friend.
So other than being your brother-in-law's friend and meeting him a couple times, you didn't really know him that well, fair to say?
Good. Yes.
Now, you mentioned at some points that Julie went outside, right?
Yes.
Nagel went outside.
Yes.
And do you know what she was going outside for?
Yes. Her brother had come to pick her up. And so she was going to go tell him, try to get him to come in.
And what, if any, conversation did you have with Ms. Nagel or Ms. Levinson in regard to their going home prior to Ms. Nagel going out and talking to her brother?
I'll sustain it in that form.
What, if anything, had you said to Ms. Nagel prior to her going out prior to her going outside?
Sustained.
Now, if you know, about how long was Ms. Nagel outside?
I believe it was just a few minutes.
And at any point in time while Ms. Nagel was outside, what, if anything, did you?
Excuse me?
So when Ms. Nagel went outside, what were you?
I was sitting at the table, and then my nephew had said another car was out there.
And after your nephew said that, what, if anything, did you do?
I went to the front door.
And front door of the home leads sort of, you walk in there, there's a foyer and a staircase in front of you.
Yes.
And as far as the front door was concerned, is there any sort of other door that's, is it just sort of the wooden front door, or is there another door in front of it?
The door was open, so it was just a storm door.
And the storm door is made out of glass, is that correct?
Yes.
So when you went over to the storm door and looked out, what, if anything, did you see?
I saw a vehicle.
And can you describe the vehicle that you saw?
I saw a dark SUV.
And as far as Ms. Nagel, did you make any observations of where she was when you looked outside?
I kind of just looked at the vehicle, and then I saw lights kind of over to this side. But then once I saw the vehicle, I took out my phone and I texted John.
And just so we're clear, as far as when you say this side, so you're standing at the storm door,
Mhm.
see the vehicle, and where's the vehicle in relation to you and where you're standing at the front?
It was straight ahead.
Now, the headlights that you were saying is sort of off to the side. From
Mhm.
your perspective, looking out at the street, is that to the left, to the right, or something else?
Left.
And as far as this dark SUV that you saw, could you tell anything else about it as far as the make or model, or did you recognize it at all?
No.
Now, at this time on January 29th, 2022, were you familiar with any sort of vehicles that Mr. O'Keefe had?
Yes.
And what kind of vehicles did he have?
Gosh, I don't know the brand. It's, it was a small SUV type.
Do you recall like what color it was?
His might have been grayish. I'm not 100% sure.
And any other vehicles that he may have had?
Yes, he had this old fashioned car that he loved, but Kaylee is so embarrassed of it. But yeah, he had that as well.
Now, as far as Miss Read was concerned, were you familiar with what kind of vehicle she had at that time?
Yes.
And what kind of vehicle were you generally aware of her driving?
She had a Lexus.
Was that a sedan or an SUV, or what kind of vehicle?
I think it was like a small SUV.
Now, the vehicle that you saw outside of the residence of Fairview when you looked out the storm door, was that consistent with what you knew Miss Read to be driving at that time?
Yes.
Now, as far as that vehicle was concerned, at any point in time over the course of the evening, did you see anyone exit that vehicle or come out of that vehicle at all?
No.
Certainly never saw anybody exit that vehicle and walk over and come inside the house.
Okay.
As far as that vehicle, when you first saw it, did you tell whether or not it was running or anything like that?
It was running. Yes, I could. I could tell it was running. It had the taillights. I could see the red.
I'm going to ask you to keep your voice up, okay?
Okay, sorry.
Now, in addition to the taillights that you saw, did you see the headlights or anything like that?
Yes, the headlights were on.
And as far as the interior of the vehicle, were there any lights on inside the vehicle that you saw at any point in time?
No.
And as far as the windows of the vehicle, what, if anything, did you observe as far as their coloration? Was tint or anything like that you saw?
Didn't observe. No.
Now, you see the vehicle sort of straight ahead of the front door, and then you pull out your phone to text Mr. O'Keefe, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall what you texted to him at that point?
I think I said here, question mark.
You think you said here, is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes. Show Mr. Jackson. Okay.
May I approach the witness, Sean?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm showing you a three-page document, just ask you to look at that.
Okay.
Just generally speaking, that three-page document, do you recognize the contents of that?
I do.
Or what do you recognize it to be?
It's my text messaging with John.
So from sort of the early part of the 28th and around midnight through, I'm sorry, the 29th through the entirety of the 29th.
Yes.
May I approach you, Your Honor?
Yes.
Almost.
Is there any objection, Mr. Jackson? Okay. Actually, great timing. So we'll have you back here at 2 o'clock. And Ms. McCabe, I'll just ask you to let the jurors.
Goodbye.
Okay, so we're still in session? That's what I was hoping for. Thank you. Yes. All right, thank you. And then, Mr. Lally, you'll be able to make those redactions that are necessary over the luncheon break?
Yes, Your Honor, I think what we can, and by we, I mean Ms. Gilman, because she's the one who can actually do these things. But no, I think we will be able to sort of take the whole numbers off of it and be able to print new copies without the numbers so that they can be
So
used.
the same version?
Exact same thing,
Therefore,
just with.
authentication, redacted for purposes of admission and publication.
Yes,
All
yes.
right, great. I appreciate that. We'll see you at 2 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, court back in session. Please be seated.
Right, so Mr. Lally, just before you begin, folks, I neglected to tell you before or during the testimony of Mr. McCabe, and I don't want to keep repeating instructions, but I do want to remind you, when it comes to electronic communications, before you can consider them in your deliberations, you must first find that it's more likely true than not that the person who authored or sent the communication was in fact the person identified as doing so. If you do not find it more likely true than not that the person identified as sending the message was the one who sent it, then you may not consider that electronic communication in your deliberations. All right, thank you. Mr. Lally, go ahead. Yes.
Those pages that I've just placed before you, do you recognize the content of those?
I do.
And what do you recognize those to?
They are text messages between myself and John.
And from sort of specifically that time period of the early morning of January 29th to the morning of January 29th?
Yes.
And what's contained in those, is that a fair and accurate portrayal of the content of those text communications?
Yes.
Now, with reference to Mr. O'Keefe, this is someone that you knew and you had his information put into your phone as far as contact.
Yes.
And on prior occasions when you had contacted, or specifically that morning when you had left the waterfall and you talked to him on the phone, you called him, and who answered? You called the contact that you had as John O'Keefe, correct?
Yes.
Okay, who answered the phone?
John.
Okay. And then the contact that you had put in as John O'Keefe called you, and you answered, and who was on the other line?
John.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
I'll also seek to introduce and admit it.
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. This is subject to what we talked about in sidebar?
Yes.
Understood.
Thank you. That's exhibit 89. All right, thank you.
Your Honor, with respect to what's now been marked as exhibit 89, if I could, with the court's permission, publish that to the jury.
Yes.
Mr. McCabe, what's up on the screen? Is that what you have before you as that exhibit?
Yes.
And this is a text communication between yourself and Mr. O'Keefe, correct?
Correct.
I'm sorry to do this. May we approach?
Sure, why don't you take that down, Ms. Gilman?
Thank you, Ms. Gilman. So, Ms. McCabe, with what's for you and what's up on the screen as the exhibits, there are sort of green bubbles and blue bubbles, right?
Correct.
And can you tell the jury as far as who's communicating which direction, as far as the green bubbles are who and the blue bubbles?
Green is John and blue is myself.
And so the first text from this particular date, if you could just read to the jury as far as from whom the message is sent, what the content is, and then what the time period is.
So John sent to me where to at 12:14. Okay.
So the next bubble down is a blue bubble, is that correct?
Correct.
Similar to the one before, can you just read as far as that? Before I get to that, I'm sorry. So you receive that message from Mr. O'Keefe, you call him, have a conversation, he calls you back for the conversation.
Correct.
And then subsequent to that, could you read the next blue bubble down as far as from whom, what the content is, and what time it is?
So this one is from myself to John, and it says here at 12:27. So at that point, I see a car out front, and I text him here. Correct. I sent to John, pull behind me at 12:31.
And what were you referring to when you said pull behind?
So at this point, the car had moved from the prior spot where I originally saw it. So I thought, what is he doing? Why don't they just pull behind me in the driveway? Me to John saying hello, and it was at 12:40.
At this point in time, as far as when you're sending these text messages over these periodic, what, if anything, are you doing sort of in between?
So I originally went to the front door, saw the car, texted them, then texted John. Then I went back, kind of sat at the table, just either threw my phone probably in my back pocket. And then a couple minutes later, I got up again and saw that the car had moved. So I had sent the pull behind me. And then a few minutes later, I went back to the window, to the front door, I'm sorry. So at this specific point at 12:40, when I say hello, I cannot be certain whether they were still out front or if they had left.
And from any of these text messages that you sent, what kind of response did you receive from Mr. O'Keefe
None. Sure. Jen to John, where are you? And that was at 12:42. Myself to John, hello, at 12:45.
Now, this is later in the morning, and we'll get to that a little bit more in a moment, but at some point you left the residence of Fairview, you went home, and you were woken by something, and then at some point you texted John later on that morning, the 29th.
Yes,
You know, the next couple of those text messages that you sent at that point.
correct. Myself to John, please answer at 4:59. Myself to John, Karen is worried. We need to find you at 4:59. Myself to John, please answer so I know you're okay. 5:04.
May I approach this retreat? Now, Ms. McCabe, if I can take you back to at the house on Fairview. Again, you're sending these text messages and going back to the table and then going back to the window at various times
To the front door.
to the front.
Yes.
And at any point in time, do you see anybody exit from the dark SUV or the black SUV you see in front of the house?
No.
And at any point in time, did John O'Keefe come into the house?
No.
And at any point in time, did John O'Keefe respond to your text messages?
No.
And at any point in time, did John O'Keefe call?
No.
Now, at some point subsequent to this, have you had occasion to look at your phone or at your call history?
Yes.
And through review of that, were you able to see phone calls that your phone made to John O'Keefe's phone around that same time frame that you were texting him and going to the school?
Yes.
May I approach Ron?
Yes.
And I'm showing you a 4-page document. After you look at that and look up when you finish. And if I could suggest, I think it starts in reverse order from page 4, timing-wise, up through page 1. Just generally speaking, ma'am, do you recognize what's contained in that 4-page document?
I do.
And what do you recognize?
The calls between myself and John O'Keefe.
And am I correct that it starts in sort of a ascending order as far as the earliest calls are on page 4 and then the most recent are on the first page?
Yes.
And the phone calls that you were testifying to about before, as far as talking to him on the way from the waterfall to residence at Fairview, did they appear in those?
They do.
Okay.
So, Ms. McCabe, as far as the first calls that you were testifying about, as far as when you spoke to Mr. O'Keefe on the way from the waterfall to the residence at Fairview, were those contained within those calls?
Yes.
As far as, is there a time that's associated with those calls that you observe in those 4-page documents?
Yes.
And what are
12:14 and 12:18.
they? And turning your attention to page 1, that would be sort of the last in line there. What time is the last call between yourself and Mr. O'Keefe, and who's calling?
I'm calling him at 5:25.
May I approach him?
Yes.
I'm about to seek to introduce him as the next exhibit.
Is there any objection?
There's not, Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ms. McCabe, you had mentioned that during the course of the evening, shortly after you arrived at the residence at Fairview, you observed a vehicle outside of your sister's house, correct?
Yes.
And Your Honor, with court's permission, I would ask to publish with this witness exhibits 71, 72, and 73.
Okay.
And Ms. McCabe, first and foremost, what's up on the screen is exhibit 71. Do you recognize that?
I do.
Okay, I think you can just go right to what you want her to identify, please, Mr. Lally.
So, Ms. McCabe, in front of you on the desk, there should be a laser pointer. Just click on the button and point at the screen. And if I could ask if you could direct, well, first, with respect to this photograph, do you observe in this photograph where you first saw the black SUV in front of the house?
It was directly if I was staring out the front door. So this angle is kind of unique to see it. But if you go from the front door directly straight out, so maybe the edge, if you understand what I'm saying. So if there's the front door and I look straight out, but the perception is almost like a side view. It's not straight on, so it could have been a little over here.
So Ally, why don't you show another picture if this one isn't helpful?
Yes, so just follow this and then come straight.
And lastly, now, Mr. Katie testified that at another point you come to the front door and you observe the vehicle in a different spot, correct?
Correct.
If you could, again, using the laser pointer, just bring your attention to where in this photograph, if at all, you observe where the vehicle was a second.
It was right about, right near the flagpole.
Okay, just come in, you can take that. Now, turning your attention to back in the home, at some point you indicated you looked out and didn't see the black SUV there anymore.
Correct.
And what was your thought as far as where John was or where John had gone at that point?
At that point, I thought maybe they decided not to come in. Maybe they got into an argument, or maybe Kaylee had called.
Did you think much of it at that point?
No.
Now, you leave the home around what time?
Approximately 1:30, between roughly 1:30, 1:45.
And when you leave, who, if anyone, goes with you?
So it's myself, my husband, Matt, and I had offered, when Julie Nagel's brother had come to the house earlier, I had offered Julie and Sarah Levinson a ride home because we had just gotten there and they had wanted to stay later. So I also drove home Julie and Sarah. Well, my husband drove them home.
And so you exit the house, go out to the vehicle, correct?
Correct.
And your husband, Matt, was driving?
Yes.
And where are you seated in?
And the front seat.
And do you recall where Ms. Levinson and Ms. Nagel were seated in the car?
They were in the back seat.
Do you recall which one was on which side?
I do not.
And when you come out of the house and you're starting to go home, what, if anything, had changed as far as the weather from when you had gone in to when you had come out?
The snow had, accumulated more.
And when you get into the vehicle and as the vehicle is pulling away, what, if any, conversation do you recall having with anyone in the car?
When I got in the car, I kind of turned around to Julie.
I'm going to allow this subject to move in strength. There's a portion that's relative. Go ahead.
I turned around and was facing them and talking to them. And I believe Sarah Levinson had laughed or made a joke because I had bread or something in my car. And we made a joke about that. I had had my niece earlier that week for the week. And so I had brought stuff in the car because I was dragging her from one of my kids' sporting events to the next.
And as, do you recall which direction, or did you observe which direction your husband, Matt, exited from residence in Fairview? And by that, I mean, did he head towards Chapman or did he head towards Susan?
Chapman.
And so as far as, I may not have asked this before, but as far as the black SUV that you observed in front of the house, which direction was that vehicle facing?
Chapman.
Each of the times that you saw it?
Yes.
And so as with that vehicle, as with the one that your husband was driving, which side of the vehicle would have been closest to the house in Fairview?
Passenger.
Now, as you're driving past the house, heading, how were you positioned within the car?
I'm turned chatting to the girls.
So, and when you're turned, are you turned towards the window or are you turned towards the console? Which way are you turned?
Turn the console towards the back seat. So my back is to the window.
And either of these girls, did you know where they lived?
No.
Do you recall whether or not you found their homes by way of sort of GPS, or was it just sort of verbal directions?
I'm assuming they just gave Matt directions to where they lived.
And so you drop each of them off. Do you recall which order they were dropped off in?
Julie, then Sarah.
And then following dropping off Sarah, where did you and your husband go?
Home.
And this whole trip sort of from Fairview to dropping off Miss Nagel, Miss Levinson, and then going home, about how long a period of time is that?
It could be 20, 30 minutes, maybe about approximately 20 minutes. Not exactly sure. Yes.
And when you and your husband, Matt, got home, went inside the house, and where did you go?
I went upstairs to bed.
And at some point, did your husband come up as well?
He did.
Was it a long period of time between when you arrived home and when your husband came up?
I don't think too long. I think he had like some cheese or something because he was on a crazy diet, and then he came upstairs.
Now, did you go right to sleep, or what, if anything, did you do when you went up to bed?
I asked him to watch a show. He said no, he was going to fall asleep, which he does usually immediately. And I went on my phone.
And what, if anything, do you recall doing on your phone as far as going on?
I was researching, my husband and I did briefly talk My daughter had gotten an offer to play on a club
Just tell us what you least.
Sure. I was researching a basketball team, and I believe I also texted my sisters, and I texted in a group chat with my husband and another individual.
Now, if I could just turn your attention back to when you were at the house on Fairview that evening, and I believe this is the last time, so I apologize for the back and forth, but when you were there, what if any videos or any music or anything that you pull up on your phone share with the group that you were there?
So one of my sisters loves this song "Raining Men," and she always, well, not always, maybe every once in a while, she's a little too much to drink and takes out an umbrella and sings and dances, and it's like a big family joke. And my other nephew had previously been over and showed me the video from whenever, I don't know if it's the 1970s, of "It's Raining Men." So I just was playing it, showing my other nieces and nephews, and we were just like laughing because they all have umbrellas, and it's just something, it's like an inside family joke. So I played that, I think, a couple of times.
And so after you get home and you're looking at the basketball program and things of that nature, what, if anything, else did you do before you went to bed or went to sleep? I should say?
Nothing. I possibly could have gotten up to go to the bathroom. I do that almost every night.
Now, at this time, you had an iPhone, is that correct?
Yes,
Did you also have an Apple Watch?
I did. Yes.
And do you recall whether or not you were wearing the Apple Watch that evening or when you went to bed or anything like that?
I do not recall.
As far as the Apple Watch is concerned, is that something that you routinely or always take off before you go to bed? Or not?
Mostly, but not always. I mean, there are times I go to bed with it on. More often than not, I take it off, but there are times that I do sleep with it.
And with respect to this particular evening, do you recall whether you had it on or whether you took it off or even had it on at all?
I don't recall if I had it on that night.
Now, bring back to that last exhibit as far as the phone calls were concerned.
Mhm.
Were there certain phone calls that you made to Mr. O'Keefe's phone around the time that you were observing the vehicle outside?
Yes,
Do you recall making any phone calls to Mr. O'Keefe at that time?
I don't.
Fair to say that at no point while you saw the vehicle outside did you have any conversation with Mr. O'Keefe?
I didn't.
Now, you go to sleep, and at some point later on in the morning, you wake up, correct?
Correct.
And what is it that wakes you up, and when about was that?
I am woken up to my phone ringing.
And do you know what time it was?
4:53.
And according to your phone, who was calling you at 4:53?
John's niece.
And so that would be John's niece, Kaylee, is that correct?
Correct.
And how old was she at this time?
I believe she was 14.
And she had just gotten into Bishop Thean, correct?
Correct.
So she was in 8th grade going in, finishing up her 8th grade year of middle school, correct?
Yes.
Is that a normal thing, that Kaylee would be calling you at 4:53 in the morning on a Saturday?
No.
So you answer the call, is that correct?
Yes.
When you answer the call, who, if anyone, is initially on the other
Initially, it's Kaylee.
end? And what, if anything, did Kaylee say to you?
That John didn't come home and Karen wanted to talk to me.
And even in that initial call, when you're speaking to Kaylee, what, if anything, do you hear sort of in the background when you're talking?
Karen screaming.
And could you hear what she was screaming?
She was just screaming, Jen, Jen, Jen,
Fairly loudly, is that correct?
extremely.
Now, at some point, does the defendant get on the phone with you?
She does.
And what, if any, conversation do you have with her at that?
She proceeds to scream my name multiple times, and she tells me that John didn't come home, they got into a fight, and that she left him at the waterfall.
And how do you respond?
I had just woken up. I was confused. I didn't know what she was talking about. I was like, what are you talking about? And then she, told me that they had gotten into a fight and she left him there. And now where is he? And she was just kept screaming my name over and over. And so then I remembered that Chris Albert had still been at the bar. So I thought, well, maybe John walked home with Chris because Chris lives close to the waterfall.
And so at some point, that conversation ended, and you recall how that ended?
I told her that I was going to call Julie and see if John had ended up with Chris.
So you hang up with her, and then what did you do then?
I called Julie Albert.
And did Julie pick up the phone?
She did not.
as you were calling Julie, did you have any conversation with your husband, Matt, around that time?
Yes. He, had kind of shot up out of bed when Karen had called. When Kaylee had called because Karen was screaming. And then he was, what's going on? And I said, well, I'm calling Julie because Karen, they got into a fight and I was trying to explain it to him. And he said, what are you talking about? We saw them outside of your sister's house. And at that point, I hung up.
And when you hung up, Julie had not answered yet. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, as far as Miss Read is that someone who had your phone number? Did you have her plugged into your phone as a contact before that date of January 29th?
No.
Never had any kind of conversation with her over the phone as far as a text or a phone call or anything. You didn't even have her information.
Correct.
And so after hanging up while calling Julie, what, if anything, did you do then?
And then I'm not sure if I called Kaylee back or if Kaylee called me back. Yes, I get Karen. I get in touch with Karen again, and I say, Karen, we saw you outside of my sister's.
And what was her response to that?
She told me that she didn't remember going there. And then she started yelling, Jen, Jen. And then she was saying, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And then she proceeded to say that she had a cracked taillight.
And this is while you're still in your home and you're in your bedroom, correct?
Correct.
And what was your response to that?
I thought she was honestly like just talking crazy. And then she said, oh my God, I left him there. Like she was extremely irrational. She said that it told me again that they had gotten into a fight. So now she was just kind of all over the place, just screaming. She was very hard to understand. So my brain started going, okay, well, if she left him there, where could he be? Who could he be with?
As you're going through that sort of process, what did you do next?
So then earlier in the night, there was another individual who we had been in contact with, or my husband had been talking to, and he had mentioned that he was going to meet up with John at Waterfall as well, but he never ended up coming. I knew he was at a house close to Fairview. So I thought, well, maybe if they got into a fight, like John might have texted this individual and maybe he just ended up on his couch.
Who was that individual?
Tom Beatty.
And who is Tom Beatty in relation to, how did you know?
He has two daughters that are the same age as my daughters.
That's one of those daughters, at least around the same age as Kerry.
Yes.
And so based on sort of that process, thought process and what you're doing, what did you do then?
So then I start calling Tom.
And at any point in time, did you call Tom? Did Tom pick up the phone? Did you speak with him?
He did not.
And so following that, what did you do?
So I know at some point I was starting to call John. My husband was as well. At that point, I get up and I'm like, okay, well, got to go out and look for him. And in my head, I was thinking I'll drive over to Tom's and maybe he's there. I then go downstairs. Matt gets up. He's starting to get dressed. I go downstairs. I make a coffee. And I'm not sure how much time passed. But then all of a sudden, I hear screaming out front.
Now, if I could just take it back for a second, as far as a decade or so that you had known and been friends with John O'Keefe, with his either his niece or his nephew or both home, is him not coming home? Is that something that had ever happened before? You were ever aware of before?
I was never,
John ever gone out at night and then not come home when the kids?
not to my knowledge, no.
So at some point you make your way downstairs, is that right?
Correct.
And then what, if anything, did you hear once you were downstairs?
Screaming
And where was the screaming coming from?
out front.
And when you heard that screaming, where did you go?
I ran to my front door. I opened my front door, correct.
And then,
Miss Read came running up my walkway.
and prior to, during any of the other conversations that you had with Miss Reed, do you know where she was when you were talking to her?
No.
Obviously, the first call was Haley calling from the house. That was
Yes.
your assumption.
Mhm.
And then subsequent.
Yes.
And as far as the second call that you were talking about, know where she was when she was talking to you then.
The first couple calls, I know she was at the house, and then I don't know.
So was opening your door, hearing the screaming from out front, was that something that surprised you?
Yes.
And when you hear the screaming, if you could just explain to the jury, how loud was the screaming that you were hearing?
very loud.
And what, if anything, was she saying?
It was more of the, Jen, did I hit him? And then she would yell, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And then she was yelling, we have to go to Fairview.
And in addition to Miss Read, what, if anything, else did you see when you opened up the door?
Just,
Did you
yeah,
see a vehicle?
yes.
Where was the vehicle and what did the vehicle look like?
It was in my driveway. I believe the driver door was left open.
And what kind of vehicle was it?
A black Lexus.
Consistent with what you had seen outside of Fairview the night or earlier in the morning.
Yes.
And so as she's coming up your walk towards your front door,
Running. Yes.
and then what, if any, conversation did you have with her there in reference to that?
I just said, Karen, I was trying to calm her down. Matt came, I believe, and was yelling down that she was going to wake up the neighborhood. And then she was yelling that we had to go to Fairview. So I told Matt that I was going to go with Karen.
Initially, before that, what were your plans as far as going to look for John before Miss Read showed up at your house?
My husband and I were going to go to Tom Beatty's.
Now, once you decide that now you're going with Miss Read, the defendant, where did the two of you go?
So as we walked out, there was a car pulled up and then a plow. No. So in the car was Kerry Roberts. And so she kind of rolled down the window and was like, Karen, what are you doing? And then the plow was behind her. So Kerry pulled up and I told Karen that I was going to drive her car because I didn't want her driving because she was hysterical. So we got in her car and then Kerry Roberts called Karen. And then Karen was screaming and, saying that she had cracked her taillight. We need to go to Fairview. Could I have hit him? Did I hit him? And then she would just scream our names. Kerry was telling her to shut up, that we needed to just go back to John's and we'll drive in one car and let's go to John's. Maybe he's there and he's passed out and you didn't see him.
When you open up the door initially and you come outside and you see the defendant out there screaming and all of that, again, with respect to the weather, what was the weather at that point?
It was like dark and it was almost like a whiteout.
And so you get into Ms. Reed's vehicle, correct?
Yes.
And you're driving that vehicle from your house to Meadow Avenue, is that correct?
Yes.
That's Mr. O'Keefe's house?
Yes.
You're familiar with that residence? You've been there plenty of times before?
Yes.
Now, with respect to Kerry Roberts, you know Kerry Roberts prior to this morning of January 29th?
I had met her once before.
And can you describe for the jury sort of the circumstances of that or how you knew her prior to January 29th?
Way back when, after John's sister and brother-in-law died, I would have Kaylee a lot and Kerry would have Patrick. And one day John said, I get a discount at Reebok. I'm going to take you guys for sneakers, get all your kid sizes. So he took Kerry and myself and we went to Reebok and bought sneakers for all my girls and me. And then he took Kerry and I to the hillside for lunch just to thank him for, helping, because that's what he did.
Now, was Kerry Roberts someone that you had as contact saved in your phone? Had you ever texted her or called her or talked to her over your phone before?
No.
So you indicated that Ms. Roberts then calls Ms. Reed's phone while you're in Ms. Reed's car, correct?
Yes.
Now, as far as that, Ms. Reed's phone, was that similar to your phone the earlier in the morning? Was that hooked up in any way or matched or paired with the vehicle that you were driving?
Yes.
So fair to say you could hear both sides of the conversation as far as Ms. Reed talking next to you and then obviously Ms. Roberts on the other end.
Yes.
So the conversation that you were talking about as far as Ms. Roberts saying, shut up and we're going to Meadow Avenue and all that, you could hear Ms. Roberts saying that?
Yes.
Now, the vehicle, when you get into the defendant's vehicle, she pulled in straight into your driveway, is that correct?
Yes.
So fair to say you had to back out of the driveway, correct?
Correct.
Now, when you were operating Ms. Reed's vehicle in reverse, what, if anything, showed up in sort of the center console area of that vehicle?
I do not remember. I don't know.
Do you recall anything as far as a camera or anything like that?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
Back the vehicle out of the driveway.
Yes.
And about how long a drive is it from your house to Mr. O'Keefe?
Approximately 5-6 minutes.
And when you get to Mr. O'Keefe's house, where do you park?
I pull in the straight in the driveway.
And after you pull into the driveway, at some point you all get out, correct?
Yes,
Do you recall who pulled in first as far as who was in front of who on the way to Meadows, yourself or Miss Roberts?
I believe I was in front.
You would have pulled into the driveway and parked, and Miss Roberts would have pulled in and parked behind, correct?
Yes.
And so after the three of you get out of your respective vehicles, what happened?
Karen brings us to the back of the car and says, look, see, I have a cracked taillight.
And where on the vehicle was she directing yourself and Miss Roberts' attention?
The back right.
So the passenger side, rear part of the vehicle.
Yes.
And when you looked at that area of the vehicle, what could you see at that?
I saw that there were missing pieces, but there was also snow covering it. And Karen was screaming, look, look. And then Kerry was screaming back at her. It was very chaotic. So I didn't stare in depth, but what I can tell you is I saw missing pieces from the taillight.
And at some point, about how long a period of time is this that you're out in Mr. O'Keefe's driveway looking at the cracked taillight?
Not long, because then Kerry's, yelling at her, telling her she's crazy and that she was driving around drunk and she could have hit anything, and kind of rushes us to go into the house to look in there for John.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask if I could publish on the screen what's been marked as exhibit number 2.
Okay.
I do.
What is that?
That is Meadows Ave, John's house.
Well, then that's not visible in this photograph, correct?
Correct.
Which side of the photograph would the driveway be? The left or right?
The right.
And Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
I'm just showing you another photograph. Just ask you to look at that. Look how it's finished.
Okay.
And you recognize what's in that photograph?
Yes.
And what do you recognize?
That's John's car.
Where is John's car in relation to John's?
It's parked to the side of the driveway.
And you also see sort of the garage area in that photograph?
Yes.
Of course, permission if I could publish that to the jury now as well.
Okay.
Now, Mr. McCabe, with reference to what's up on the screen, is that the photo that you just had before you?
Yes.
And there are 2 garage doors on the house at One Meadows Ave, correct?
Correct.
Left and a right, is that fair way?
Yes.
And you've been inside Mr. O'Keefe's house a number of times before, correct?
Yes.
Now, with respect to the garage door on the left, what was stayed within that part of the garage?
His old-fashioned car. Yes.
And on the right side of the garage, what if any? Do you recognize what's in those photographs?
Yes.
And what do you recognize those to be?
The defendant's vehicle.
May I approach?
Yes.
You want to call him up to speak?
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
With the court's permission, if I could, Ms. McCabe, what's depicted in this photograph is the defendant, Ms. Read's vehicle, correct?
Correct.
And in sort of focus here is the right rear passenger side of that vehicle.
Correct.
And the taillight, if you could, with the laser pointers, just direct the jury's attention to where you observe that. Now, ma'am, with respect to what's depicted in this photograph as far as any damage that you observed to this taillight area on the rear passenger side, is that consistent with what you observed in the driveway at One Meadows Ave when the defendant was showing?
Correct. Minus the snow, etc.
Again, do you recognize what's depicted in this photograph?
Yes.
And this is essentially a closer image of that same rear passenger side taillight area, correct?
Yes.
Again, what's depicted in this, is that consistent with what you observed minus sort of the caked in snow when you were in the driveway of Mr. O'Keefe's house on the morning of the 29th?
Yes.
Gentlemen, you can take that down in your honor. With the court's permission, I would ask to publish just a short portion of, actually, I'm sorry. If I could publish a portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 6, which is the ring camera from the driveway.
Okay.
Ms. Gilman, if I could have video number 154 from the driveway. Ms. McCabe, directing your attention up to the screen, what's been marked as Exhibit 6 or video from Exhibit 6. Do you recognize what's depicted in this video?
I do.
What do you recognize?
That's myself getting out of the car at Meadows Ave.
Is that essentially where you parked Ms. Read's vehicle when you pulled in?
Yes.
If you could, just direct the jury's attention with the laser pointer as to where Ms. Read's vehicle is that you parked and if you see Ms. Roberts' vehicle.
That is Miss Reed's, and that would be Miss Roberts.
And as far as the right garage door that you entered into the house, if you could direct the jury's attention to whereabouts that would, I know it's not on the video, but where would it?
Walk straight.
If you could run this in its entirety. Ms. McCabe, what was depicted in that video, is that consistent with what you observed, the weather conditions to be around the time that you arrived at Mr. O'Keefe's house?
Yes.
And lastly, in this line, Your Honor, if I, with the court's permission, could publish just a very short portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 41. Gentlemen, if I could ask you to fast forward this to about 2 hours and 10 minutes. If you could play the next. Stop there. And again, what's in this video, do you recognize that, Mr. Kate?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize that?
That is John's house.
Ms. Gilman, if you could play it from there. Ms. Gilman, if you could stop. Now, what's depicted in this video, sort of the screen directly in front of you, do you recognize what that is?
Yes,
What do you recognize that?
John's driveway.
As far as what, if anything, do you observe in John's driveway?
John's car and Karen's car.
And where, if you could, using the laser pointer, just direct your attention to where is the defendant's car and where is Mr. O'Keefe's?
Mr. O'Keefe's car and the defendant's.
And where you observe the defendant's car to be, is that essentially where you parked it at that time?
Yes.
Now, may I have a moment?
Okay. I'll see counsel at sidebar for just a minute. Jurors, I just want to tell, I appreciate counsel trying to work together for this. It's probably going to take too long, so we're just going to make do. We've had enough interruptions today. So.
Now, Mr. McCabe, as far as what you observe from what you can on the screen right now, the condition of the passenger side tail light, is that consistent with what you observed when you parked the vehicle there sometime earlier that night?
It's kind of hard to see from this distance.
Let's go and you can take that. Now, Ms. McCabe, you then yourself, the defendant, and Ms. Roberts then get into Ms. Roberts' vehicle, is that correct?
Yes.
Seated where within Ms. Roberts' vehicle as you're going from Meadows Avenue? Or what was the plan and where were you going sort of first when you left Meadows Avenue?
We were going to Fairview
And why were you going to Fairview?
because Karen kept screaming, we need to go to Fairview.
Now, who was seated where within the vehicle when you did it?
Kerry was driving. I was in the passenger seat and Karen was in the back.
And what are the lighting conditions at this point that you're driving over there?
It was hard to see out the window. You really had to be kind of staring out. It was dark. The snow was coming out the car.
And as you're making that drive, or as Ms. Roberts is making that drive from Meadows Ave to Fairview, about how long a drive is it?
Approximately 10 minutes. I mean, with the weather, the lights, the street lights, I would say about 10 minutes, give or take.
And as far as during the drive from Meadows Ave to Fairview, what's going on inside the car over the course of that ride?
Karen is in between us, like from the back, kind of pushing up in between Kerry and myself. And she's just screaming, Kerry, Kerry, her name over and over, my name over and over, and repeating certain phrases. Could I have hit him? Did I hit him? Kerry is yelling at her to shut up, to sit back, to buckle up, to look for John.
And while this is going on, what, if anything, are you and Ms. Roberts doing in the front seat?
She's slowly driving and I'm just peering out the window looking for John. I mean, it was a crazy situation. She's screaming, he didn't come home. Could he be walking home? Where is he? So we're just looking out the window, looking for John.
Now, during the time that this is going on and Ms. Read is sort of screaming in between you, was that continuous or what, if anything else, did you see her doing in the back seat while you were going from Meadows Avenue?
I didn't see her doing anything. She just continuously screamed that. And then as we got by different landmarks, she then started, screaming, asking if John could be at certain people's houses,
And whose houses was she asking
if she could be at Bella's house.
referring to the directions that you had provided the night before?
Correct.
And so that would have been, Bella was a child who was around the age of Kaylee and your daughter, correct?
Yes.
And there have been some years in the past dating relationship between Mr. O'Keefe and Bella's mother, correct?
Yes.
And so Ms. Read is saying that in the car that morning as you're driving over to Fairview?
Yes. She asked, could he have been with Ashley? And I looked at her and said no, because to me that was a crazy idea. And then Kerry had mentioned, oh, do you think he could have called somebody else that lived on a street over? And she started screaming, who's that? Who's she?
And you recall who Kerry referred to?
Yes.
And who-
A woman that John had previously dated.
And was that anywhere recent in time to when you're driving around on January 29th when they had dated?
No.
So similar to Bella's mother would have been years before.
Correct.
And so when Ms. Roberts said that, what, if anything, did the defendant say?
She was just spiraling, yelling about Ashley, who was Bella's mom, and just talking what I thought was very irrational about John maybe being with her.
So you're looking around outside of the vehicle as the vehicle is going down towards Fairview, is that correct?
Yes.
And you recall how it was that Ms. Roberts came about coming to Fairview similar to the night before? Did she come in from the Chapman side or from the Cedar Crest side?
Chapman.
And as the vehicle turns from Chapman onto Fairview, what, if any, conversation was going on at that point?
Well, Bella lives on that street, so that was when that conversation was being had. Also, just a continuation. It was just like continuous screaming of our names. Kerry screaming at her to sit back, and then sometimes she would sit back and almost like be quiet for a minute, and then it would start all over again.
As you were coming down Fairview Road, what, if anything, were you saying to Ms. Roberts did Ms. Roberts know where she was going as far as where your sister lived?
No, I told her that my sister lived at the bottom, and then as we got closer, I said, just past, see where those trees are? Just past the trees is my sister's house.
As you got in that area from the residence of your sister at 34 Fairview Road, trees that you're talking about, where are they in relation to the property?
They're at the start of the property is the trees, and then their property begins.
And so the flagpole area and fire hydrant that you were talking about in earlier exhibits, is that in the same area as the trees?
Yes, it goes the trees and then the fire hydrant, then further up is the fire hydrant and the flagpole.
As you're coming down Fairview now, approaching 34 Fairview, the house would be on which side of the vehicle, on the driver's side or the passenger side?
The driver's side.
And as you approach that area where trees and the flagpole and the fire hydrant were, what, if anything, happens then?
We drive past the flagpole area, and all of a sudden Karen starts screaming, there he is, and she's banging to get out.
And banging on the door in the back seat.
Yes.
And at the time that she's saying this, were you able to see anything outside of the vehicle?
I saw nothing.
And what, if anything, when she's banging and kicking or banging on the door, what did Ms. Roberts?
Miss Roberts unlocked the door. Karen got out. Miss Roberts looked at me and said something like, she's crazy or she's batshit crazy, something like that.
And when the defendant gets out of the vehicle, where is it that she goes?
She just runs
And runs with?
straight to John.
And again, when she's running, at this point in time, can you see what she's running toward or where she's going or anything that she's talking about?
I was on the passenger side. So as I got out, she was already at John.
So she gets out and essentially makes a beeline over to where John was,
Correct.
and you're getting out of the passenger side, and by the time you come around the car, she's already there.
Yes.
And when she gets over there, what, if anything, could you see at that?
She straddles John and she lifts up his shirt, and then she lifted up her shirt and went to lay on him. And Miss Roberts Miss Roberts went over and she was removing the snow from his face.
Let me take a step back from that just for a moment. In your honor, with the court's permission, I would ask to publish just a portion of what's been marked as Exhibit 12.
Okay.
Now, Mr. McCabe, I'm going to direct your attention up to the screen of what's been marked as Exhibit 12, and I know this is not something that pertains to your vehicle or anything else. But what I'm going to ask you as it plays through is if what you observed in this video is consistent with what you observed during the drive to Fairview Road Avenue. I'm just going to, if you could play. As this video is running, Mr. McCabe, if I could just ask, what you see in this video, is that consistent with sort of the lighting and the conditions weather-wise that you observed when Ms. Roberts is driving from Meadows Avenue to Fairview?
Yes.
Do you recognize whereabout in the town of Canton this is perspective-wise as far as what street?
Yes, that is Cassie. We just passed Cassie's Corner Store, and that is Chapman Street.
Again, Ms. McCabe, do you recognize whereabouts in the town of Canton we are in this portion of the video?
Yes, this is the top of Fairview.
So this will be from Chapman coming on to Fairview, is that correct?
Correct.
And prior to that, along that ride along Chapman, is that the period of time you're looking out the window and trying to see if you can see John on the side of the road?
Yes, but we didn't drive that way.
You came from the other direction?
Yes. Yes.
What's up on the screen of what you just observed as far as the drive down Fairview, is that fair and accurate material consistent with what you observed when Ms. Roberts was driving down that morning?
Yes.
And at this point in time, as you're coming sort of down the hill from Fairview, is this point that the conversation occurs as far as mother and prior dating relationships and things like that?
A little bit more towards the top of the street.
So Belle's mother lives more closer to the top by Chapman.
Midway down, yes.
The vehicle in the roadway there, do you recognize that?
Yes.
And what do you recognize that to be?
Miss Roberts.
For clarification purposes, with the laser pointer, if you could direct the jury's attention where you see Ms. Roberts.
Oops.
Now, the area where you observed Mr. O'Keefe, can you see that in this particular frame of the video?
Not in this frame. I cannot. It's not clear.
You see that area now?
Yes.
I'm just coming, if you could play this for. If you could, fast forward just about. Make it pause. Okay, do you recognize any of the individuals up on that screen?
Yes.
And if you could, with the way the corner direct your attention.
Kerry Roberts, myself, Karen Read.
Ms. McCabe, if I could just take you back to when you arrived there. When Kid and Ms. Read goes over to Mr. O'Keefe, Ms. Roberts, what is it that you were doing at that time?
I got out of the car and I came around, and for a second or two, I completely just froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then Kerry and I made eye contact, and I called 911. And Kerry was asking me to go to the car and get, she was yelling to get towels or blankets or something out of the back of our car.
Is that why the back of the car is opened up in the video that we just saw in reference to Ms. Roberts' vehicle?
Yes,
Did she direct you sort of where to go within the vehicle to find the blankets or the towels, whatever it was?
yes,
Now, you called 911, you spoke to the operator and told them essentially where you were, correct?
yes.
Now, as far as that initial, what you saw, that you froze and couldn't believe what you saw, can you describe to the jury what it was that you saw?
I saw Kerry wiping the snow off of John's face, and I could not believe that that was John laying there.
And how was John positioned, or how was his body positioned when you saw him?
He was just laying flat on his back.
And as far as the snow Ms. Roberts was wiping off his face, was there any other snow on his body at that time?
Yes,
And if you know about how much?
there was enough that his body was covered in snow.
Could you tell at that point how far Mr. O'Keefe was from the roadway as far as Fairview Road was concerned?
I mean, I remember kind of a little ways in. I don't know exactly.
And so you make that call to 911, and what is sort of going on with respect to Ms. Roberts, the defendant, and Mr. O'Keefe while you're on that 911?
So I run the blankets over to Miss Roberts, and she's kind of lifts him up, put the blankets underneath him, and she's screaming at Miss Read to get off of Mr. O'Keefe. And they're kind of yelling back and forth. Karen's screaming, "Is he dead? Is he dead?" I, at some points, walk over towards the car, Kerry's car, to get away because they're so loud. And I was trying to be calm and get help there for John as fast as possible. Kerry starts yelling about doing CPR. She tells Karen to do mouth to mouth. Karen's yelling because as they start, blood starts coming out of John's mouth.
As far as the CPR, that's what you're talking about?
Yes,
So during this time, the defendant's yelling and you're on the phone with 911, correct?
yes,
So you're trying to back up or distance yourself a little bit so that you can hear what's going on with the 911 operator and they can hear you.
yes.
And after you complete that 911 call, what's going on at that point?
I go over, and at that point, Kerry asks if I can take over doing the compressions.
And did you do that?
I did, yes.
And at some point after you call 911 to either police or fire or someone responds and arrives on scene, is that correct?
Yes.
You know about how much time it was in between when you hung up with 911 and when the first responders start to arrive?
When I hung up, maybe a few minutes. I'm not exactly sure.
And do you recall whether or not it was police or fire or who showed up first?
Police.
Is that the officer that was in that video or that cruiser that was just up on the screen as the last?
I didn't see the officer in the video, but I know it was Officer Saraf was the first officer to arrive.
And so then after the officer arrives, what happened?
He was trying to figure out what had happened. Karen just ran around screaming my name, Kerry's name. Is he dead? Is he dead? It was on repeat. Could I have hit him? Did I hit him? More officers started to arrive. The EMTs, they began to work on him.
And while him, and by him you mean Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes,
And Mr. O'Keefe's still on the ground and they're working on him there, is that correct?
yes.
did you see anything about sort of what they were doing or what was going on with that?
No, I just saw a bunch of them around Mr. O'Keefe.
And then what happened then?
More officers began to arrive. Miss Read just continued to run around screaming. As more officers and EMT arrived, they asked what happened. One EMT asked, one EMT had asked, his name, his age, things like that. If she knew what happened, Miss Read stated that she hit him. Besides running around saying, I hit him, did I hit him, could I have done this? Is he dead? Is he dead? At one point, one of the police officers put Miss Read in the back of her cruiser, and he asked for myself to go over with her, and Kerry came over with us as well.
I'd like to just take you back to when the paramedic is asking for information, biographical information, things like that. You indicated that the defendant said, I hit him, is that correct?
Yes,
That's something that she said once or more than once?
3 times. I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
Now, before you had made reference to statements she made with sort of qualifiers or questions as far as could I have hit him or did I hit him? Is that what she said at that time when she was speaking to the paramedic?
No, she was earlier. It was could I, did I? When she spoke to the paramedic, it was crystal clear. I hit him.
Now, one of the officers takes her over to the back of a cruiser, is that right?
Yes,
You were over in that area as well?
yes.
Who, if anyone else, was over in that area?
Miss Roberts.
And while you were over in that area, what was going on over there?
We were in the back of the police cruiser. Karen was sitting in there. I kind of scooched myself in. Miss Roberts came over. Karen grabbed our hands. She asked us to pray. She looked at her hands and she had blood. She asked us if she could have gotten her period. We told her no, that was John's blood. Then she said, what if he's dead? Promise me you'll take care of the kids. Someone's going to take care of the kids. Then we prayed. Then at the end, they were moving John. And at that point, Karen told Kerry, go over, look, is he dead? Is he dead? Is he dead? Over and over. And Kerry said, I'll go over and check on him. And she was yelling, are they working on him? And then at that point, she grabbed my hands and she said, Google hypothermia, Google how long it takes to die in the cold. And so I had my phone out and it was cold and my hands were frozen and I have MS, and I took my phone out while she was screaming and shaking my arm, and I attempted to Google how long does it take to die in the cold.
And when you conducted that search, that was at the defendant's request on scene sometime after 6 a.m. on that day, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall whether or not that came up as far as your search in Google? Is it something that you typed once or more than once? If you know?
I believe I did it multiple times because as I was typing it, I don't know what else was coming up. She was screaming. My hands were shaking.
And do you recall anything as far as what the search results were, or did you click on anything, or did you get an answer to the question the defendant had posed to you?
I don't even think I got an answer because as I kept Googling and she kept yelling, and then they were moving John. And the next thing I knew, we were kind of moving because she wanted to see if they were working on him.
And so you were moving along with the defendant over towards where Mr. O'Keefe had gone to the back of the ambulance?
Yes, we kind of just moved to see what was going on.
When you moved over, what did you see then?
They were just putting him in the back of the ambulance.
Now, after Mr. O'Keefe was put into the back of the ambulance, where did you go then? What did you do?
At that point, different police officers, I believe, were arriving, and they were asking questions about what happened.
And did you speak to those officers?
I did, yes.
And at that point, did you know what happened?
No, to be honest, it was like I was there, but everything was just going on, and I was completely just in a state of shock and disbelief.
And that sort of period there, how long did that go on?
So I talked to a few officers. We tried to just give them, he didn't come home. We went out looking for him, kind of just the brief overview. And then one of the police officers asked me to go into the house and to wake up my sister and my brother-in-law.
And at some point while you were outside, did you try to contact your sister and your brother-in-law?
I believe I called my sister, Nicole.
And when was that in relation to everything as far as medically that was going on with Mr. O'Keefe and all?
I think I might have called her right after I got off with 911 possibly. And then, she didn't answer. And that's when I was walking over, I believe, to John.
And she didn't answer the call when you called her initially?
No.
And do you recall calling either your sister Nicole or your brother-in-law Brian Albert prior to going into the house?
I don't recall. I know I did call Nicole at one point. I'm not sure if I called Brian or not.
Regardless of if you called or you didn't call, do you recall having any sort of phone conversation with either Nicole or Brian Albert before you went in the house?
No.
So you at least called your sister Nicole, she didn't answer, and then one of the officers directed you to wake them up.
Yes.
And when you went up to the house at 34 Fairview, how did you get in?
The front door.
And the front door was unlocked?
Yes.
Is that typical from your experience at that residence?
Yes.
And so you went to the house, and where did you go?
I went up the stairs to their bedroom.
And bedroom door, when you arrived there, was it open or closed or something?
Closed.
And you opened it?
Yes.
And when you opened it, who, if anyone, did you see in the room, and what were they doing?
I saw my sister and Brian, and they were both asleep.
And you familiar with a dog that they have?
Yes.
What was the dog's name?
Chloe?
Was Chloe in the bedroom as well at that time?
I don't recall.
You come in, they're both sleeping, and what happened then?
I go over to the bed and I'm calling out their names.
And how long were you calling out their names before you got any kind of response?
Brian responded first and he was very, startled and looked at me like, what is going on? Nicole took a little, and, I think it took Nicole a little bit longer than Brian to wake up.
And what is it that you're telling them as you're coming into?
I'm telling them that we just found John out front, and I could have possibly said, John has died. We just found John out front. They were very confused. At one point, I think Brian was like, who's John? I mean, they just woken up and they had no idea what I was talking about.
Now, as far as when they're first waking up and you're explaining to them, how would you describe sort of their demeanor as you're talking?
They were both shocked. I think they thought, like, why? Okay.
What I'm asking them is just sort of when you observe them, how would you describe your physical observations of what they look like, their demeanor in that?
Shocked, confused, not understanding.
Objection, move to strike.
Strike the last one.
Now, as far as this conversation that you're having with your sister and your brother-in-law in their bed, how long was that going on?
A few minutes at least.
And then following that, where did you go?
They got up, got dressed, and then we walked down the stairs.
And when you got to the bottom of the stairs, what, if anything, did you see?
There was a police officer at the bottom of the stairs.
And do you know who that police officer is?
Yes, Officer Lank.
At that time, did you know who that police officer was?
I did, yes.
How did you know?
He's from Canton. He was, 5 years older than me. I knew him kind of growing up, who he was, and met him through the years. Yes.
And were there any other officers with him initially?
No.
Now, before you go into the house, do you know where Ms. Roberts and the defendant were, or what they were doing when you went to the house?
I believe they put Karen in a car, and
Only if you know. Only if you
okay.
If you know. Do you know?
Karen was in a car. Kerry was walking all around.
Now, as far as the ambulance with Mr. O'Keefe, at the time that you go into the house, was that ambulance still there?
I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it had left.
And when you come downstairs with your sister and your brother-in-law, and the officer's there, you have a conversation, is that correct?
Yes.
Where did that first conversation occur?
In the hallway and then into the kitchen.
And from there, you mentioned that there was Officer Lank at one point. Were there any other officers that joined that conversation at some point?
Hours later, yes.
And so during that initial conversation, you're talking to the officer, who, if anyone else, not what they said, but who, if anyone else, is speaking to the officer.
Brian and Nicole.
Conversation initially with the officer, do you know about how long that went on?
I don't. A few minutes.
And following that conversation, what did you do or what happened?
My husband arrived.
And had you called him?
Yes.
And when had you called him?
I called him when I was walking in the house to wake up my sister and Brian.
As you're walking in, you call your husband Matt, and then he arrives at some point after you're done talking to the officer, or while you're talking to the officer?
The officer was still in the house, yes.
And so in that vein, as far as when your husband comes in, the officer's there, correct?
Yes.
Did you see your husband talking to the officer as well?
Yes. The officer asked him to step outside or step to the side, and they spoke.
And then what happened then?
The officer told me to stay. The officer told me to stay, and that he said that the state police would be coming to talk to me.
So you stayed at the house at 34 Fairview, is that right?
Yes.
You know where Ms. Roberts and the defendant?
Yes. Kerry came up, and she had told me that
At some point, did you see Ms. Roberts and the defendant go?
yes, to pick up John's parents.
As far as they left in Ms. Roberts' car, is that right?
Correct.
Ms. Roberts was again driving.
Correct.
And at some point, did you observe them come back to the house?
Yes.
And about how long was it between the time they left and the time they came back?
5 minutes approximately.
And after they came back to the house, what, if any, other activity did you see outside as far as first response?
I was in the house, so I didn't see Miss Roberts pull back up.
You were in the house for most of the rest of the time that you were there, is that correct?
Correct.
And how long were you there that morning waiting for the state police?
I believe I left approximately 11:30.
During the time that you were there, you're there, your sister Nicole Albert's there, your brother-in-law Brian Albert's there, and your husband Matthew McCabe's there, correct?
Correct.
Was there anybody else that arrived at some point over the course of the morning while you were there at the house?
Yes.
And who was that? And if you know about what time was it that they arrived?
Julie Albert.
Now, with reference to when Julie Albert arrived, at some point around that time, did you have occasion to look out and see sort of what was going on outside?
No.
Were you aware whether or not there were any police or fire or anything that was still there at the time that Miss Julie Albert arrived?
There wasn't.
And she comes in the house, and at some point, I'm assuming she's informed of what had transpired there before her arrival, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
And when she's informed of that, what, if anything, did you observe about her demeanor or how she reacted?
Shocked.
Now, in addition to Julie Albert, who, if anyone else, was at the house that morning while you were there?
Officer Lank and Gallagher were there, and Brian Higgins came that morning.
And do you know how Brian Higgins came to know, or how Brian Higgins came to be there that morning? Did you know?
I don't know.
Now, you mentioned that Officer Lank came back to the house, is that right?
Yes.
That was after some period of time when he had left?
Yes.
He came back with another officer named Gallagher, is that right?
Yes.
And why did they come back to the house?
Because I called Officer Lank.
And did you have his number, or how did you get his number if you did?
Julie Albert gave it to me.
And so you called Officer Lank, he then comes back to the house on Fairview, is that right?
Yes.
And when he came back, what is it that why had you asked him to come?
Well, as I was sitting there and I was waiting for the state police to come, I was slowly trying to piece together what had just happened in the last couple of hours. And he had told me, if there's anything that you remember, if you remember anything, please, give me a call.
And so there was something that you remembered and you gave him?
Yes.
And when he came back to the house, what was it that you told him?
I told him about the comments and the remarks that Karen Read had been stating that morning.
And specifically, what type of remarks are you referring to that you told Officer Lank when he came back?
I said that she told one of the EMTs that she hit him.
Now, at some point, you indicated that you left the house on Fairview, is that right?
Yes.
And with your husband, I presume?
Yes.
And where did the two of you go?
We went home.
And your children were still there without you or your husband there, is that correct?
Yes.
And once you arrived back home, what is it that you did at that point?
We went in the house and Officer Proctor was coming over to speak with us.
And that Officer Proctor, is that someone that you knew previously or had ever met?
I had never met Officer Proctor.
And did he come alone or was he with someone else?
He had another officer with him. Yes, Yuri Buchanan. No.
When you get home, about how long was it at the time from when you arrived home with your husband to the time that the officers from the state police came by?
It was pretty quick.
Now, in addition to the officers from the state police, did anybody else come over to your house on that day, morning, early afternoon?
Yes, my brother-in-law, Brian.
And do you know why he came over that?
Yes, he came over. I had asked him, he's like a big brother to me, and I was all shaken up and nervous and overwhelmed, and so I wanted his support.
And he obliged and he came over, correct?
Yes,
Now, at some point after the officers from the state police came over, you spoke to them, is that correct?
yes,
And do you recall where in your home you spoke to them?
in my dining room.
When you spoke to them, was it both of the officers that were present?
Yes,
And was there anybody else present in the dining room when you were talking?
no,
And as far as your husband or your brother-in-law, Brian, do you know where in the house they were when you were in the dining room?
yes, they were in my bedroom.
And at some point later on that day, those same officers talked to both your husband and your brother-in-law, Brian.
Yes,
And during each of those respective conversations or interviews, do you know where you were in the house when those were going on?
in my bedroom.
And when you were in your bedroom, could you hear anything that they were saying downstairs in the dining room?
No,
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes,
Can I approach, Your Honor?
yes.
I'm showing you two separate pages.
Okay.
Do you recognize each of those documents and what the content is?
yes,
And those are essentially, one contains text messages that morning of the 29th between yourself and Ms. Read, correct?
yes,
And the other one is sort of the list of phone calls between yourself and Ms. Read from that morning as well.
yes.
Before I get into those, as far as after you had gone inside the house and Ms. Read had got into Ms. Roberts' car, what if any other communication or what if any other communication did you have?
I texted her asking for Kerry's phone number because I didn't have it. And I also had a phone conversation with Karen when she was in the ambulance.
And that text communication that I placed before you essentially has one bubble on it, and that's you asking for Kerry Roberts' number.
Correct.
And the phone conversation that you had with the defendant, when was that, and you know where the defendant was at the time that you spoke?
Yes, she was in an ambulance.
And if you could describe to the jury sort of what, generally speaking, what was the content of that conversation? What did the two of you talk about?
She just was repeating, asking if he was dead. Is he dead? She brought up the kids, and then she also asked if I would visit her.
And how did you respond?
I said yes.
Following that phone conversation, did you have any further communication in any form that you can recall with the defendant?
No.
May I approach?
Yes. Objection, Mr. Jackson? 94.
Just a couple more questions, ma'am. Now, you had asked defendant Ms. Read for Ms. Roberts' information because you didn't have it, correct?
Correct.
And at some point, did you receive that information from the defendant?
No.
And did you receive that information from any other source?
I must have, but I don't recall how.
And as far as asking for Ms. Roberts' information, why were you asking?
She was on the way to pick up John's parents and to bring him to the hospital. And I wanted to check in on them and then further updates from Kerry about John and how he was.
You wanted to know how your friend was doing, correct?
Yes.
No further questions to this witness. Your Honor.
4 minutes before, I think we're way too much.
I don't think I can get it done in 4 minutes.
All right, children, we're not in session on Monday, so we'll come back Tuesday morning. So Tuesday will be a half a day. Someday next week, I might ask you to think about maybe revising some of these Tuesday, Thursdays to longer days, but I'll give you plenty of notice of that. I need to make sure that the board, I'm just asking you to think, right? So please, those same cautions, do not discuss this case with anyone. Don't do any independent research or investigation into this case. If you happen to see, hear, or read anything about this case, please disregard it. Again, leave everything here, literally, figuratively. Clear your heads and we'll see you fresh Tuesday. All right, so I'll see counsel at sidebar about scheduling.